Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Object Class Clinical Tone, another episode of the show where your hosts, A Random Day
and Captain Kirby,
argue with each other and call it a podcast. On tonight's episode, Clinical Tone, the bane of every author's existence at some point or another, made worse because what we call clinical tone is really more of a mishmash of guidelines, rules of thumb, and cultural thoughts that have been assembled over almost a decade and a half. So why bother with clinical tone in your articles? And more importantly, how can you make it work for you? Before we can answer those questions, we should ask, what is clinical tone good for? The obvious answer, of course, is verisimilitude. The SCP Wiki acts like we are a real organization of bureaucrats who are documenting and containing weird stuff that breaks the laws of reality. That's our whole gimmick. We pretend we're real, we act like we're real. Clinical tone helps us sound like we're real. But a less obvious answer that I think not too many people really think about is obfuscation. Clinical tone requires more effort to process, and just by nature of how you present information in that clinical tone, you can assemble a chain of innocuous sounding ideas that can coalesce into something absolutely spine-tingling. So I'll point to my own SCP-3001 as a personal example of this, mainly because the Great Hippo and I worked pretty hard to make sure that we obfuscated information and set up this chain of horrible little breadcrumbs. SCP-3001, The Hero's Journey, is about a very big centipede. And it describes how this centipede hibernates for a long period of time and occasionally gets the hankering to feed on small mammals. And to do this, it sets up a bizarre lure where it acts like a human being and it releases pheromones that make small mammals a little more suggestive and a little less scared of stuff. And then we learned that it can actually create a dimensional portal that leads directly into its stomach. And finally, we found out that it was discovered in Ireland, surrounded by the bones of almost 70 children. The article describes a centipede setting up a weird lure to feast on small mammals. We talk a little bit about how it sets up that lure, how it eats, and then we get to the end and we find out that it's pretending to be a wizard so that it can trick little kids into entering its stomach. We don't find out about the kids until the very end of the article. And because all this stuff comes together in bits and pieces, and because the clinical tone makes everything sound a little more understated, a little more scientific, a little less, okay, it's doing X, Y, Z, the clinical tone hides the reality of what X, Y, and Z are until we get to the very end. Another really great example of obfuscation in an article is SCP-089. I'm not going to spoil anything about this article for you because it is one of the gold examples of using clinical tone to obfuscate information and to arrange that information in a way that an innocuous chain of ideas coalesces into something brutal. In particular, I think SCP-089 does a really great job of forcing the reader to put the pieces together in their own head. And when you use clinical tone to make the reader put the pieces together, you make the end result hit that much harder because you can make the reader not quite sure if they put the pieces together. That uncertainty of solving the puzzle adds to the horror as well, because you can't quite be sure if you got it right. You think you got it right, but you're not quite sure, and that just makes things a little scarier. Which I think is another great way to use clinical tone. Tone setting. You can use clinical tone to obfuscate horror and hint at it to create a sense of unease. One of my favorite examples of that is SCP-2602, which used to be a library. So 2602 is a little bit of a format screw, but the important thing is that what it is a building that used to be a library. We also find out that in SCP-2602's basement, it contains an extensive subterranean component of the kind generally found in former libraries. However, some of the debris inside SCP-2602's basement exhibited elevated levels of Dewey radiation, preventing access to several shrines that were likely used to assist SCP-2602's reading groups when it was a library. SCP-2602 tells a lot of stuff. It tells us about radiation and shrines and subterranean components, and so we get the sense that there's a weird religious nuclear dungeon or something going on under the hood of SCP-2602. But because it uses clinical tone to say to describe underground as subterranean, because it doesn't outright say nuclear, it says elevated levels of radiation. Because it doesn't say there was a cult in the basement, it says we couldn't access the shrines in the building. The author Scantron uses clinical tone in this article to hint at a lot of really weird stuff that's going on underneath the surface of this thing that used to be a library, and generates a sense of unease from both the juxtaposition in what's supposed to be a library and what's going on, and also the fact that we as readers, we're not really getting a sense of the true picture of what's happening, because the clinical tone that describes the article puts distance between us and the reader. We have to use our own knowledge to translate the clinical tone into layman's terms. And because we don't actually know if we're translating correctly, that just kind of adds to the unease and the tone of the piece. We get the sense that this is a weird building. Why it's super weird, but I don't know why it's weird, and that just makes it weirder. That is another perfect example to me of how you can use clinical tone to enhance the presentation of your article. By using clinical tone judiciously, by arranging your information judiciously, and by using clinical tone to not necessarily make the information impossible to parse, but by making it a little bit challenging to understand, by forcing the reader to by giving them a few puzzle pieces that they have to fit together, and using clinical tone to stop them from having an answer key, you create fridge horror, you can create unease, and you overall enhance the presentation of your article from oh, XYZ happened to alpha, beta, gamma happened. We think that alpha, beta, gamma are XYZ, but we're not quite sure, and that makes the article that much scarier.
Yeah, clinical tone, it's a built-in part of the format. You have to, when writing certain parts of your entry, you have to use it, because if you don't, then you're going to be breaking suspension of disbelief because of the nature of what's expected of SCP writing. But that doesn't necessarily have to act as an inhibitor. It can be used largely to the benefit of the article. There are certain lines and certain descriptions of things in clinical tone which in some ways are subdued compared to how one might describe it in traditional prose, but even in that subdued manner can feel significantly more brutal. It's just an extension of obfuscation, and the tone setting is that you can get certain lines. The example that comes to mind is unfortunately a spoiler for 089, but the whammy line in 089, you can't use the wording that it uses in traditional prose unless your entire prose leading up to it is in clinical tone, because it relies so heavily on that kind of estranged wording, but in doing so creates something significantly more direct and powerful than the more flowery way of describing it.
I agree with you. I think that one of the most challenging parts of using clinical tone in the SCP format is that you really have to commit to it in a lot of places. When you're writing clinical tone, you got to make sure that everything in your article that is being written by the Foundation has to be in clinical tone. And it can be pretty challenging to maintain that clinical tone throughout the piece. But of course, you don't have to use clinical tone everywhere, and in a lot of places, you shouldn't use clinical tone at all. There's always going to be room to experiment in the SCP format and avoid clinical tone to make things work better. So I guess my question for you, Kirby, is what isn't clinical tone good for?
So, clinical tone, you can't necessarily get around it, but sometimes you can do things to sort of circumvent clinical tone because it's not great for everything. As ARD pointed out before, clinical tone creates, by virtue of how difficult it is to parse sometimes, and because of how it kind of obfuscates some things, it creates this feeling of detachment. But that isn't always necessarily going to benefit a story. Sometimes you want a story or an article or certain sections to be kind of wrought with emotion. You want to be able to use maybe more flowery language to get across certain descriptions. And if you want to make your words carry emotion alongside just the thing that they're describing, then usually clinical tone is not going to do that for you. One of my favorite examples of an article that throws clinical tone to the wind for a large section of it because of the necessity for much more emotional diction and verbiage, the very well-known SCP-3001 Red Reality.
I'm a big fan of this article. 3001 damn near won the 3000 contest, and for very good reason.
Yep. just a brief intro for people who don't know. The anomaly for 3001, if you have not read it before, is described as a hypothesized non-dimension that essentially you can get in through to via a wormhole that has to do with Scranton reality anchors and reality bending shenanigans. But at the end of the day, it's a place locked away in the universe that you're not supposed to get to. It's a non-location. Except somehow the Dr. Scranton managed to find his way in there. Like, that information that I just summarized is the description. The description is 3 paragraphs, very short, pretty to the point. And then we get 5 collapsibles that are just the audio logs from Dr. Scranton, presumably while he is in this pocket dimension. There's very little clinical tone used throughout these logs. It is mostly just his narration, occasionally a little bit of clinical tone to like describe certain noises that aren't just the dialogue from him, but most of it is just him. It's just him talking. And it's really important that we're given the dialogue directly and not that we are given clinical summaries of what's being said, because a lot of the emotionality of the piece comes from watching Dr. Scranton's effective descent into madness. The emotional roller coaster he goes on in his isolation is made apparent and realized through what he says and the way he says things. You get to see his hope, you get to see his hopes be dashed. And all of this is made possible because we are effectively ditching clinical tone. You won't get a lot of the humanness in his voice from a summary, because you really could if you wanted to. You really could replace most of these logs with a summary and you would get the main points across. But that wouldn't do the emotional core of this piece justice. So, like, 3001, in my opinion, is a great example of it uses clinical tone for the parts it has to, and then for the point of the article, for the main story that it's trying to tell, it just ditches clinical tone. It effectively ditches, in some ways, the format. Like, if you rewrote the intro to 3001 kind of just as a short blurb intro that was not necessarily formatted as an SCP, and then you just gave the exact same follow-up logs, it would be maybe not just as powerful of a story, but it would be like the main core of the story would not be lost, because the main core of the story exists in this non-clinical tone presented through these logs.
I agree with you completely. But because this is presented as a transcript, in a lot of places the article uses clinical tone to give the reader space to like imagine sounds that are happening in their own mind, like sobbing, retching. The way it says that stuff, it like gives the reader space to imagine that in their head, and because it's understated, it takes a moment for the reader to like really imagine what's going on. And I think that really amplifies the horror.
Yeah, I agree that the places here where it does use clinical tone, it uses the clinical tone to essentially emphasize what's going on in the non-clinical tone parts. I would say it reads less like clinical tone and more like notes from a screenplay, but that's fine. At some point, those are kind of indistinguishable due to the nature of what you would write there in a screenplay and what you would write there in clinical tone. Like, you're going to just use the same words, and you're not using a lot of them. Even though it can sometimes read more like a screenplay than necessarily like clinical tone and scientific, it still does a very good job in both situations of taking this understated, very flat presentation and description and using it to contrast this heavily emotional dialogue that we're getting. Even so, the article is reliant mostly on the emotional dialogue. 3001, in my opinion, is a great example because it's so obviously just like goes straight into a format that's not this SCP format. It's very much just audio transcripts, which can be kind of pulled away a little bit from the format. There's other examples, though, of articles that don't do this as explicitly, where they use non-clinical tone but in a format that makes more sense for an SCP article, and it feels a little bit more contained in the epistolary structures that we already know and love. The example I have in mind for this is 3515. 3515 is also an article that is mostly audio transcripts, but it's different from what we see in 3001 by virtue of the fact that it's more formatted like a back and forth. There's 2 characters that go back and forth more often, and there's a lot more injection of clinical tone here because it reads much more like any other interview or exploration log transcript. But still, here it's used for a more similar reason to 3001, but like I would say I can approach it with a slightly different spin to 3001. Here it's used to develop two characters' interaction and relationship as they explore this anomaly. The anomaly itself for 3515 is a painting where if you go to sleep near the painting, you disappear from the real world and you wake up in this strange new dimension. I'm describing this now. I'm seeing some funny similarities to 3001, but trust me, it's a very different article. There's only one example of like what's in this new plane. The one other thing that you know going in is that when everyone who goes to sleep, between when they go to sleep and when they wake up, they always hear the sound of like heavy shoveling and like the sound of soil being moved. The article, though, mostly consists of the back and forth between the D-class experiment subject and the doctor on the other end. And there's a lot of articles that are kind of formatted like this, where it consists of transcripts that have a back and forth between two characters, because the article is not so much built around just the anomaly itself, but it's also built around exploring the characters presented. If you were to summarize this with clinical tone, you would lose a lot of the human nature and you wouldn't really be able to create such an explicit, detailed character arc between them. You wouldn't be able to demonstrate the building of trust as clearly and emotionally, and you would not be able to demonstrate the dissolving of that trust and like the panic and all of that, because clinical tone can only go so far in its diction and its own restrictions in presenting very heavy emotions. There's one other kind of thing that clinical tone doesn't do as well, which isn't as apparent in these examples, and I think it's something that's probably best used in Pedantics 5959.
5656. I know exactly which one you're talking about now.
56 is what I am thinking.
I love 5656. It is so good. 5656 has one of my all-time favorite methods of like getting away with non-clinical tone. I love it to bits.
Yeah.
The presentation is outstanding.
5656, it's a very well constructed thriller. As a thriller, it is very well put together. The tension ratchets up. But as part of the thriller, it has a number of relatively high octane action scenes. And one thing that clinical tone also does extremely poorly is action. If you want someone to be in a moment where there are guns firing, where there are punches being thrown, where there are explosions, there are car chases, where you are in the throes of action, clinical tone is going to take that and slow it way down. And it's going to remove a lot of the tension from it because, again, it's going to feel disconnected. It's going to feel disjoint. It's going to feel neutral and emotionless, which is not what you want. You want the reader to feel like they're in it. You want them to feel the energy, and you want to keep them on their toes.
I think one thing that like we tend to forget when we are writing clinical tone is that it's by its very nature, it absolutely kills pacing.
I wouldn't say it kills pacing. It kills the speed with which you read an article, which is different than killing pacing.
Yeah, it kills. Okay, yeah, that's fair. But I still think that like one of the reasons SCP articles need to be brisk is because just clinical tone means that it's just going to be a little bit harder to read than regular prose. So you want to reduce the amount of stuff that your reader has to, well, read to enjoy it.
And like coming back to how that specifically relates to 5656, whenever it has these action scenes, what it does is that it kind of presents them in context of, it acknowledges who you, the reader, are supposed to be in universe, and it presents this new way of viewing log files, as in essentially you get inside the head of like one of the people who are there. And so instead of presenting it as an actual transcript, it presents it in this prose from second person point of view, because the point is that supposedly you are seeing this from your own eyes if you are the person reading this in universe. And so the person in the universe is reading this and experiencing these things, and so we out of universe readers get this via second person prose, which is kind of a format screw. It's breaking the format a little bit because it's breaking from the epistolary nature of SCPs, but it's not like a huge format screw. And essentially what it lets the author pedantic do is that it lets the action scenes be told in this very high octane manner. It ditches clinical tone entirely. It puts you in the center. It even uses second person to really make you feel like you're in it. The prose here is actually like really, really smoothly done. As far as action writing is concerned, 5656's action scenes are some of the best I've read in a long time. that's kind of what you get when you get away with shifting away from clinical tone, is that you can write these much more high speed, high octane scenes. I realize I've been using high octane a lot, but like that's the best way for me to describe what this is because it is so intense.
5656 puts sweat on your palms, dude. It's really great how it uses the clinical tone to frame these sweaty parts. But the sweaty parts would not work if they were clinical tone, and that's the key difference. Clinical tone is great for enhancing the presentation of your article, but at the end of the day, it's an enhancer.
Now that we have Art talked about why you use clinical tone, and I talked about reasons why you don't use clinical tone, I wanted to actually bring up an example of how the strengths of clinical tone and the strengths of non-clinical tone can kind of come together to really make a piece stand out and pop. And I want to talk about the very recently posted, at least as of the time of recording, SCP-3352 by the Great Hippo. Now, Hippo, I will croon about Hippo a lot on this podcast.
Hippo is the king of verisimilitude.
He's so good.
He understands how to use clinical tone to its fullest. He knows how to use it to obfuscate information. He knows how to use it to create a sense of unease. But he knows, most importantly, how to blend it with non-clinical tone to give, the uncanny stuff the hint of realism that it needs to feel like something that could actually have happened.
So, 3352 is an article about a steel beam that is anomalous. Most of the article, though, details the events surrounding the discovery of the anomalous properties of this steel beam, which are cleverly not even directly stated in the description. It's a very explicit choice made by Hippo to leave that until the end.
It's one of the great examples of obfuscation. The article is about the steel beam, but he describes the article as being an event associated with the beam. Not the beam itself, but something that happened to the beam.
Yeah. Even though the steel beam itself demonstrates obviously anomalous properties, but he wants to avoid telling us what those are until the very end, because that's what it's what the article is building to. It's a question that you kind of come in, you're like, oh, there's something up with the steel beam. Then afterwards, the majority of the article is dedicated to describing this event. Essentially a chain of miniature incidents that occur at a refinery. One of the things that's kind of interesting about that is you get bits of clinical tone that, in a very scientific and reserved manner, will describe what happened in the refinery as if this were a technical write-up of what happened, which gets bonus points for verisimilitude because by virtue of the nature of the events and the nature of the write-up, it's sort of like scientific writing, describing certain procedures that you would maybe be writing up for safety documents. It describes certain chemical reactions that you would maybe see in a chemistry textbook. It's stuff that you would see written in other media because in this tone, because this story and this event is very much grounded in reality until we reach the very, very end. But not only does it have the clinical tone bits that really draw you into the realism of the story because you've seen people write about these sort of events and this sort of tone before, it also contrasts that with excerpts from interviews with the people involved. And this is how you start to sort of get a very grounded and emotional aspect to the story, because you see the people describe their emotions kind of like you might see with a news story. People going around interviewing, you see they ask questions about what they saw the night of the incident. If this is not anomalous and this was a normal incident at a refinery, these excerpts are what make people kind of understand the truly drastic nature and how it affected the people on the ground. And it serves the same purpose in this article as these same interviews would serve a news segment. It gives you an idea of what the people on the ground were going through, and in context of a piece of fiction really grounds the emotionality. And so you get these two kind of back and forth. You get, oh, I see my chemistry textbook, which is telling me what's going on. And then, oh, I have these interviews from people who are really experiencing the shit that's going down and how terrifying that must be for them. Until you reach the very end of the article, where again, the punchline, the whammy line, is actually delivered first in interview style. So it's delivered not in clinical tone, but using a more natural, more human voice, so you can get the emotional impact from it. And then it's kind of expanded upon just a little bit in the clinical tone in a way to kind of ground it back into this detached nature of, oh yeah, this is something that really happened.
Yeah, the article combines clinical tone and non-clinical tone to make you feel like you just read, like, almost makes you feel like you watched a History Channel special. Like a good History Channel special, too.
Yeah, yeah. I'm not gonna spoil it. It's really short, anyways. 3352 is a fantastic example of like what clinical tone helps with, what non-clinical tone helps with, and how the two can be used in tandem with each other to tell a really, really good story.
It's just a fantastic piece of short fiction, and definitely one of my favorite articles in October.
Hippo killed it again. No one is surprised.
Grass is green, water is blue. What else is new? Okay, so we understand, like, what is clinical tone good at? What is it not good at? How do you put them together? But more than that, like, how can we really, like, maintain clinical tone here? Clinical tone on the SCP Wiki is basically a bunch of informal guidelines and rules of thumb that have, like, amassed over 13 years of internet culture. And three things that I've kind of noticed when it comes to writing clinical tone: be concise, not casual. Your description should be functional, not flowery. And probably the hardest thing of all, clarity is more important than clinicality. Like, I'll go over these in a little more detail. When it comes to being concise rather than casual, it means you should avoid colloquialisms like shouldn't, wouldn't, and couldn't, but at the same time, don't use vocalize, use say. Don't use compact disc player, use CD player. The key is to make your article sound like it was written by a doctor or a researcher, but that doesn't mean that you need to go overboard and, like, make it sound like it was written by a Scrabble champion. Which comes to the next point of, like, qualitative descriptions need to be functional, not flowery. As an author, it's totally fine to be invested in, like, how your anomaly looks, thinks, talks. That's all important aspects of its character. But as a writer, you should work so that your description is, like, detached from the anomaly, so that you can allow stuff like interview logs, tables, action sequences, and stuff. You can allow the non-clinical stuff to carry, like, the emotional and, like, the prosaic weight of your article, and use the clinical tone to maintain the verisimilitude and the tone that you want the article to initially present. Using industry terminology is a great resource that straddles the line between clinical and, like, understandable tone, which leads me to my final point. Like, clarity of writing is always going to be more important than, like, clinical tone. 3352, the original version of it that I read, it was so deep in clinical tone that it was, like, hard to understand what was actually happening at a lot of points because of, like, and because of how dense the article was initially, it was damn near impossible to actually understand, like, what was happening by the midsection. So Hippo put a lot of work into, like, cutting down a lot of extraneous details and making sure that at any given point, what was actually happening could be understood after reading the sentence. Obfuscation is great when you want to obfuscate what's happening, but when you want to add verisimilitude or set the tone of your article, you want to try to avoid, like, overly obfuscating what's happening. And if you go too heavy on the clinical tone, you can really fall into that bog where your article is so heavy on jargon and, like, multisyllabic terms that it's impossible to actually figure out what's going on. You got to be careful to strike that line between clinical and clear.
Yeah, I think that's really important because it's one thing for clinical tone to make people think more when they're reading a piece because they have to parse and put together the sentences more themselves. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you want your reader to feel like reading the piece is a slog. You still want it to be gripping, but you get to be a little less immediately engaging with your prose because people are going in with the expectation that it's clinical tone. Again, that doesn't mean that you get to just run away and use terms and sentence structures that are just unnatural to read.
You want your reader to work to understand what you mean, not what you say.
Yeah, yeah.
Clinical tone is another one of those things that is, like, the best way to get good at it is to practice, but I hope that tonight's episode of Object Class Podcast helps our listeners get a baseline feel for, like, what clinical tone is good at, what clinical tone isn't good at, and tips to help them improve their clinical tone and, like, take it the extra mile.
You can write an SCP using entirely clinical tone. That's doable. It happens a lot. But one thing that's definitely more prevalent in at least more modern SCPs is the mixture of clinical tone sections and non-clinical tone sections. And being able to balance clinical tone with non-clinical tone to get the best use out of both of them is an aspect of SCP writing that will go a long way in making your article pop.
The site was founded on the sense that what was happening in these articles was something that you could picture as having happened in the real world. And clinical tone is one of the keystone elements of the site in creating that verisimilitude, in creating that sense of an uncanny valley, and in creating that sort of modern horror that the site is indicative of. But you gotta be careful that when you have a hammer, you don't see everything as a nail. Really, that's all I have to say on the matter. Kirby?
I believe that we've covered it pretty well, at least for what makes sense for the scope of this podcast.
Fantastic. Everyone listening at home, I hope you enjoyed tonight's episode of Object Class Podcast. Thank you, and good night.